About to get started. Got a lot to talk about. So today's lecture, well, really this whole week is going to be about files. It's going to be about files. So if I have some file that exists with some data in it, how do I use that in my program? How do I read from a file? And Thursday, or if we get to it today, how do we write data to a file? That's what we're learning this week. So I'm gonna go into a little bit about like why we will want to do that and like how to get started with it. And then there's different ways we can read from a file. Depending on what our data looks like, we have to read it a certain type of way. I'm gonna call those techniques. I want this to be like more so hands-on, but I gotta give you the tools first. So I got some class work that we can work on like together and like individually. So I'm gonna try to get to that halfway through the lecture and then show you what your homework is. Questions before we start? So, intro to files. So essentially, like any real world program, right, we have, our app has to like work with data, real data. A lot of times that data is stored somewhere like a database or some file that has like a bunch of usernames and passwords, something like that that the program reads from in order to do some job, right? Most programs actually use a database, and that can be considered like a file, right? It's some place that exists that has a whole bunch of data, and the app or the program reads from it to do a certain job. So that's essentially like why files are important. And so we have two ways we can use them. We can read from them, and then we can also write to them. So let's say a user signs up for an app, right? They type in a username, a password, some of their information, and once they click sign up, that data gets written to a file or to a database. Let's say the user wants to do something else in the app. They may have to read from the database in order to display the information on the screen. So we're always constantly reading and writing to and from files or a database. So let's see the steps that we have for reading from a file. The first step, and we haven't really seen this word object, but as you kind of transition from this class into CS2, you're gonna hear that word object being used a lot more. It really just means variable, but it's not of a type that we've seen before. So I'm gonna show you what that really looks like. But the first step for reading from a file is create a file object. Create a file object. When you create the file object, it's going to open the file for you. The second step is to check if the file was actually opened successfully. The reason why we have to do that is we could ask C++ to open a certain file, right? But let's say that file doesn't even exist. In that case, the file wouldn't be successfully opened, and we can't read from it because it was never opened successfully. So we have to check first, was this file opened successfully? Third step, if we were able to open the file, let's process it. Let's start reading that data that's inside the file. Normally, we want to know what that file looks like on the inside to be able to read from it in a certain way. Because remember, there's different ways to read from a file. Sometimes we want to read line by line. Sometimes we want value by value. It really depends. It depends. But this third step is to start reading the contents of that file. And lastly, close the file. Once we're done reading from the file, we have to manually close it. We have to manually close it. Any questions on the steps before I start breaking them down? So the first step, remember, you're creating a file object. The first thing you're going to have when you're dealing with files is a new include statement. So we have include something called fstring. F stands for file. Include fstring is the first thing we need if we want to work with files. Either reading from the file or writing to the file, we need fstring. Without fstring, we cannot do anything with files. And of course, like the ellipsis up here just indicates we could have other include statements, whether it's IOStream, CMath, whatever it is. We're starting to build out these larger scale programs now that use a bunch of different libraries. After that, here's an example of, let's start with this. Here's an example of how I can create that object, that file object. I start with my type. This could have been, well, I guess from what we've seen so far, we had like int, bool, double, char, string. In this case, we're using something called IF string. This means input file string. We have to have that as our type. That's the type of object we created. Next, we have to name it. The name in this case is input file. Just like any other variable, we give it a type and we give it a name. The type is IF string. The name of it is input file. Inside of the parentheses, we must have a string. This string is going to be the name of the file that we want to open. So by creating this line on line 8, I'm saying create me a file, an input file. We're going to call it input file. And it's going to have the contents of whatever this txt file is right here. So I have to have that txt file somewhere locally on my computer in order for it to successfully open it. So just like I said here, we create the object, we name it, we give it the type, and then in here we have to put a string. So it could be a variable or it could be a string literal, a raw string, with the file that we want to open. These are the two main things to kind of get you started with creating the object. We following so far? So boom, to break this piece down a little more. Like I said, the first thing is to have your type. Normally we're used to seeing the primitive types, int, bool, char, string, double, all of those. Bless you. In this case, we have to have IF string as our type. To tell C++, this isn't a string, this isn't a char, this is an input file that we created. It's an input file. The second thing is the name of this variable. So anywhere later in our program, we can reference this input file and let's say we want to open it or close it or do something else, like start reading from it. We need to have a variable to use in that case. So secondly, we have to name it. Normally for input files, we name it like input or file or even input file. Something that lets you know later on in your program that this is referring to an input file. And then thirdly, like I said, we have to have a string within these parentheses. This string is going to be the file that we're actually trying to open. This string has to be some file that we're actually trying to open. And it has to exist already. Otherwise, it can't open.
The file extension always have to be TX.
No, it doesn't have to be. Nope. But for this week, like your homework and stuff, it'll be TXT. It could be an Excel file. It could be a doc. It could be PDF. It could be whatever. But certain files, I think, have restrictions. Let's say you open a PDF. I don't think you can write to a PDF. I think a PDF is just the PDF.
So, the IF string, if you ever ask us, types of data type, could we put IF string?
I'm gonna say no. I'm gonna say no because I'm gonna say no. There's a reason for it, but like this isn't really a data type necessarily. Like it sits in the place of a data type, but it's really something called a class. So if you ever seen the word class come up in like say a video or something, IF stream is a class that has a way for you to create objects. So that's gonna be CS2, you're gonna like really see what I'm talking about, but that sits in the place of a data type, but it's not the same as like string, bool, and those types. But good question though. Any other questions on the syntax for creating the object? All right, so tell me, how would I start creating this object? What goes in box number 1? And these are the instructions, right? I want to create the input file for some file called my_file.txt. What goes in box number 1? I have string. The name. What are we going to name it? I think in this case I just put file. My bad. I should have put that joint up there. And what's in box number 3? my_file.txt. Exactly. So let's say, remember step number 2, after we create this object, is we want to try to start reading from this file, right? We want to start reading from it. But in order to do that, the second step is I gotta check if it's open. Because let's say I passed a string, and that string is supposed to represent some file, but that file doesn't exist. So in this case, my program would crash if I don't first check if the file is open. So I want to use some function that's available to me called is_open. That's the function that I have available that can tell me if the file is open or not. So we think, what does this function return? Based on how I explain like what it does. What does it return to me? True or false? True or false. And let's say my object, like from the last slide, is called file. How could I check if the file is open? Put it inside the parentheses. So how would I write the whole statement out? Close. Close. Help me out. I wanna write a statement that can check if the file is open. If statement, okay.
If is open inside the parentheses file, then return true.
No, it's gonna have to do with if it's equal to true or false, right?
You can do that. I'm gonna get a whoops. If it's gonna read just like English. If the file is open.
Oh.
Literally. Literally. So is open is a function
Yeah, so it's gonna.
that the file has accessible. So the file has different functions that it can use, just like open and .close. It has these functions or utilities that it can use. One of the functions that it has available is open. And that tells us if this specific file is open. If this returns me true, so technically, like you said, I could do equals true or equals false. But if I leave that out, this automatically just checks if the condition is true.
And if you don't wanna, put the equal to, and wanna check this is not open, you just put
Yep, exactly. Yep. So if I wanted to check if this is not open, I could just put the exclamation mark in front of it to negate the condition. I think I got it. So yeah, we need this because file could be talking about some TXT file that doesn't really exist, right? Or maybe it's corrupt and broken or virus, or for whatever reason it can't be open. So we always have to start our check with if the file is open, then in here we're going to start actually playing around with the file.
What makes a file like corrupt?
In terms of this, I don't know, but like there have been files like I tried to double click on my laptop, for instance, and it'd be like, cannot be opened or something like that. You ever had that happen? Like you can't open it. So I mean, I feel like that's probably a good case, but I think the main case is the file that this is talking about doesn't exist.
Oh,
So what about like zipped files?
I wonder, that's a good question. I wonder what would happen if we tried to open a zip file, like in this case. I'm actually curious to try it out and see what happens. Any questions on checking if the file is open first?
what goes inside the bracket, like after,
Right here,
yeah.
it's gonna be step 3, which is actually reading from the file. So everything we do related to reading the file is gonna be inside of here. So now for what you asked for, the reading techniques. There's 2 main reading techniques that I'm gonna go through. So when we process this data, remember we're reading from a file. This file could be 1,000,000 lines long, it could be 5 lines long. We don't really know, right? We just know the name of the file that we're reading from, and we might have some idea of like what the data looks like. So for this, we're gonna use a while loop. We're going to use a while loop to go through all the data in this file. But I got a question. Why do we think we should use a while loop versus like a for loop? Anybody got an idea?
We don't know how much data.
Exactly. We don't know how much data there is. We don't know how much data could be in this file. So we're gonna use a while loop, and then we have a way to check if we've reached the end of the file, and that's when we stop reading. So like you said, we don't know how much data is in the file, hence we don't know how long to run a for loop. So a while loop is gonna become super critical for reading from files. So the two ways that we can read from a file are reading individual lines using getLine, or you can read individual values, and that's going to look a lot like CN. It's going to look a lot like CN, but it's a little different. And this is going to allow you to get values that are separated by spaces. So when we've seen this symbol before, right? What normally goes like, let's say on the left side of this? CN. And what goes on the right side? A variable, right? Because we're reading some value from the user into a variable. We never gave a name to these symbols, but today we are. This is called an input operator. This allows you to do input. This just simply allows you to do input. CN is saying how we're going to do the input. This could be something else, and today we're going to see like what that something else could actually be. But in a nutshell, this operator allows you to read some input from a certain source. So that source could be user input, or in this case, like today, it could be a file. We could be reading data from a file. So like I said, input doesn't always have to mean we want a user to give us the value, right? Users aren't the only way for us to get values. We could also get values from a file. And so this next slide, I'm gonna show you how. So instead of what we have here, using CN, we can actually just replace that with the ifstream object that we created. So what we did in step one was create the object. We can place that object right here, the name of it, and that'll allow us to start reading data from a file instead of from the user. That allows us to read data from the file instead of the user. So I'm gonna show an example. So remember, the first thing we have to do is check if the file is open. If the file isn't open, we don't even want to try to read from it because it's not gonna work. The file has to be open for us to read from it. I'm gonna explain like what needs to go on in here in a second, but I'm gonna show you like how we can use that CN or input operator approach to start reading values from the user or from the file. So what do we think? I mean, we talked about it a little bit in like the previous two slides, but if my file is open, right, how do I know how long to run this while loop for? What do?
Until there's no more data left.
Exactly. Until there's no more data left. He's gonna say the same thing. You sure? Exactly. Exactly. I meant to put this up before you answer, but Brody gave me the answer. So while there's more data left, we should keep reading, essentially. So I'm gonna show you the two techniques that we have for actually constructing our while loop. The two that we have are, like I said, getLine. We've seen that before. And we've seen our input operator before, but we're used to using CN with it. We're used to using CN, but instead we're gonna use that file, that ifstream object. So we're not doing CN, because CN is waiting for the user to type something in. We don't need the user in this case. All we need is the file. And in order to do getLine or even like CN, we need variables first. We need variables first. So before you can go into your while loop, you need your variables. You need variables before you can go into your while loop. So if I'm reading data line by line, let's say I want entire lines at a time, I'm gonna use getLine. If I want values separated by spaces, I'm gonna use my input operator. So let's say in the first example, I'm reading full names, line by line. I'm gonna use getLine and I'm gonna say, take a line from the file and store it inside of full name. Every iteration of this loop, I'm taking a new line and I'm processing it and put it inside of this variable called full name.
How would
a separation between what?
Because if they're all gonna be named full name, how
Right.
is it gonna know like to
Okay,
call,
okay,
like
yeah.
how is it gonna get confused? And
Right.
stuff like
So each iteration of the loop is getting a new value. It's getting a new value. So I mean, it's not keeping them all over time. It's only keeping a value for like that period, that loop period, right? So once it reads it, you're supposed to use it. Let's say print it out, and then the loop runs again, and it gets a new value, and a new value, and a new value.
Oh, okay.
So if you want to save it, we haven't learned about like lists. A list could be used to store it, or you could just write all the values to an output file. It's like you have different ways, or you could just print them out. We're gonna start with just printing them out. So every iteration, we're gonna print it out. And likewise with the input operator, we have to have a variable for each value that we have, right? So let's say, in this case, and both of these are working with full names, right? The first one, we're taking the whole full name and storing that in the variable. In the second case, we separating first name and last name into two different ones, just like we've seen with CN, right? If they enter two different values separated by a space, we're gonna store them in different buckets. That's all this is doing. The input operator is doing the same thing. It's saying read a line or read two values, store the first one inside the first name, store the second one inside the last name. So for that iteration of the loop, you have two variables that you can use, one for first name, one for last name. Versus if I use getLine, I only get one variable while I'm reading the loop that has the whole full name inside of it. We following?
So it goes line by line, right?
getLine does.
Line.
Mhm.
So it could be like a full sentence.
Right.
It would still work.
Right.
You could just rename the variable, the string, like sentence or something.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool.
Exactly.
But how would that work for the input operator if you had like a full sentence?
You can't. Just like if you were doing CN versus getLine, right? And you actually use it to type in a phrase, you're not going to use CN for a phrase because you don't know how many variables to use.
Right.
Same exact concept. Like, don't think of this any differently. It's the same exact principles. So, I mean, I guess we kind of already talked about them, but before I can use getLine or using my input operators, I need the variables because I'm trying to take it from the file and put it somewhere inside of my program. So I need my variables in order to do that. So before I even go into my while loop, I'm gonna create my variables. I recommend creating them between the if statement that checks if the file is open and the while loop. That's where I'm gonna create my variables. I don't need these variables to have like function scope, so I'm not gonna create them at the top of the function. I don't really need them outside of what I'm using them for, which is just reading from a file and printing the values out, or let's say sending those values to an output file or something like that. So I only need them while I'm working with the file, which is inside of the if statement. So that's where I would create them. Between the if statement and the while loop is where I would create my variables so I can use them in my while loop. And I'm gonna show what that looks like. So like I said, I have my if statement. This just checks if my file is opened successfully. Then we say we need our variables. If the file never opened, we didn't even need this variable to store a name because we can't even read values from the file. So I'm gonna only create them if the file is successfully open. Then inside of my while loop, I'm gonna use one of my techniques. What's the first technique? getLine. What's the second one? Input operators. Input operators. So I can replace technique. Depending on my use case, I'm gonna use one or the other. So in the first case, let's say I'm reading, like I said, values line by line, I'm gonna use getLine. So if I'm reading a full name, I'm gonna say take it from the file and store this current line inside of name. So inside of my while loop where I have some code at, that's where I can use the variable name and let's say print it out. Or check if it starts with an A, or I can do whatever I want like I would do in a normal program. The other case is I'm reading value by value and those values are separated by a space. For every value that I have or I want to read at a time, I need a variable for it. So in this case, name can only store one value basically. Once it hits a space, It's gonna stop right there and say, this is all you gave me. This is like, you only gave me one variable to store values in. So if you wanted to store more data using the input operator, you would need more variables. Just like when we saw CN. For every value that we expected the user to enter, we need a variable for it. We following? Cool. So maybe consider this for a second, turn the talk, chop it up. Scenario is, I have a file, right? The file has some numbers in it. It's only one number per line though. So let's say the first number is 1, then 2, then 3. It's going down. It's going down vertically. I want to read each value and only print, I want to print it out, print each value only if the value is even. So I want to print all the even numbers from the file. Give it like 30 seconds to think about what we learned so far, how we can do that, what technique we might use for it, and then I'm gonna walk through the code. Let's say it don't matter what the name of it. I forgot what it actually is.
I was working on it, but I didn't.
Oh, the homework?
Yeah, I was trying to see.
Yeah, it's that one right.
Do we use the name to say file open, or do we just put file down?
Oh, you missed the first part, that's why.
Oh.
You gotta make like an object and stuff.
Oh,
You remember how to do it? What, the numbers in the file?
yeah.
Let's say you have no idea what it starts at. Cause remember, you could be reading this data from anywhere. It could be a file that's up in the cloud. You just know the name of it, and so you can't really like assume it's gonna start with any number. Anybody have an idea? Any ideas? Any ideas? No?
I mean,
No?
only thing I can think about is like divided by 2 or something.
Yeah, so the same way that we normally checked if a number is even, right? That's the same logic we're going to use. But this is actually like one of the classworks. So I'm not going to give all the code, but I'm going to give a rundown on the skeleton. So the first thing that we start with is what? What's the first thing we start with if we want to work with files?
The
F string. You need this in order to tell C++ you have intentions on working with a file. Always got to have it. Second thing is your object. Your object, remember, there's 3 parts to it. IF string to tell C++ this is going to be an input file, because there's also output files. So you got to specify. IF stands for input file string. Then I have to name it so that down below, if I want to actually like manipulate this file or close it, I have to have a variable name to reference that file. So in my case, I called it file. Then I pass the name of the file that I'm trying to open. In this left panel, this is what my data looks like. And this is called my_file.txt, which is why I put my_file.txt inside of those parentheses and quotes. The third piece is checking if the file is open. Because let's say I put empty quotes right here, right? That is not going to successfully open because that's not a valid file, right? So I don't even want to try to process anything inside of it before I check if it's open. Otherwise, my program is just going to crash. So I check, is this file open? And this is just considered our safety check. And like I said, I always create my variable between the if statement and the while loop. So since I know I'm reading in one number per line, technically I could use getLine or use my input operator, right? But this says print the numbers that are even. If I use getLine, it's going to give me those values as strings. right? Get line only does strings. Strings are useless if I want to know if a number is even, so I need them to be integers. So that's why I'm using my input operator. Input operator, you can specify what to read the value in as. So I have integer in. Each value that I read in is going to be an integer. So the first time this loop runs, it should read 1, then 2, then 3, all the way down until 10. Yep. So that's going to go down there. So this is the important piece, this while part. What this says is while, and this is me actually reading in the value. So I'm saying while the file is able to read in a new value, do it. So this in itself, it does two things. It checks if we're able to successfully do it, and it actually does it. Again, this while loop, I'm saying while we're able to read a value from the file into our variable in. If this is ever unsuccessful, that means we reach the end of the file, we can't read any more data. So at that point, the loop will stop. So basically how we've done like CN and getLine, we're gonna put that directly inside of the while loop condition. Because that's going to directly tell us if it's successful or not. Anybody lost on that part? All right.
What, I got a question about the quotation marks. Do we have to have that?
Up here?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Has to be a string. So that could be a string variable, or it could just be a string, how I have it here. These first examples, I'm showing you how to do it with the quotes.
Okay.
So yeah, you always have to have a string inside of it.
Alright.
Are we lost on this while loop piece? Hello?
You explain it one more time?
One more time. So basically, right, our objective is to read in these values one by one. Let's say starting with 1, we want to check is 1 even. If so, we want to print it out. Then we move on to 2, then 3. In order for us to grab this value and like examine it, we need to basically pull it into our program. Because right now it's just sitting inside of this TXT file. So we're saying in our while loop, try to use the file, which got created up here. Try to use the file and read in a value into n, our variable. If at any point that doesn't work, the loop is just going to end in itself. So this thing, like I said, it does two jobs. It tells us true or false if the operation is successful, and it actually does the operation for us.
Wait, it is open.
So is the
like
file-
existing function?
So is the file is ending into the file?
Sorry, say that one more time.
So like, is the file becoming in, or is in like checking the file?
So file isn't becoming in, but one value from it is.
Oh.
So we're taking this one and putting it inside of n, and it's going to do all these operations. Then when the loop goes back, it's going to read the next thing, then the next thing.
So where's the calculations like to decide
If it's even?
Yeah.
So that's going to go inside of here. So once we read in a value, like I said, first iteration is going to read in the 1. For the duration of this iteration of the loop, n is going to have a value of 1. So that's when we can check is 1 even, if so, print it out. And so once we have no more instructions in here, the loop goes to the next cycle, and it's going to try to read in another value. Because we do have another value, it's going to work. It's going to read in the 2. It's not going to stop working until we finally check if 10 is even and print 10. And then when we get to the next loop, it's going to try to read in a new value, but there is no new value. So that's when the loop ends. It ends naturally.
Okay, so my question is this, right? For the lines, and there are 10 lines. So the 10 lines, is this just because this is an example, or if it's 10, if we know it's 10 lines, then we could have just used the for loop. Does that make sense?
So yeah, I wasn't gonna put nothing like that run off the screen on there. So like you said, this is just an example. So sure, if in this example you could have just done a for loop. Let's say the prompt was only reading the first 5 numbers. Then yeah, that's finite, right? So you could like say, okay, run a for loop to just read in 5 numbers. But normally when we read it from files, like this example said, print all the even numbers because you don't know how many. Like there's no dot length for a file, so we just gotta read it all the way through. You still had a question?
You probably already said this, but you know how you started the object part? Are we always gonna start it like that? If string file?
Yeah.
Okay.
For input files, this is IF input file.
Alright, good.
And then lastly, our last step is manually close this file. Manually close this file. So after my while loop, I say file.close. I call the close function. Disclaimer, it's going to do it for you anyway, just like return 0. But it's great practice. Like you will always see people close their file. And if they forget, people complain and whine about it. So make sure you're doing it. Make sure you're doing it. Right. Questions on this piece? Mm.
So right there on that if statement, where it say file is or file dot is open, is that opening the file?
So the file gets opened in this blue box.
Yeah.
This creates the object and it opens it all in one.
Okay.
The orange piece just checks if it was successfully opened. Because let's say I put empty quotes. Let's say I didn't have an actual value right here. I put empty quotes and tried to open a file that has no value, right? It can't open a file that has no name because that's not a file to begin with. So before we start trying to just read it as if we know for a fact it's a valid file, we gotta check first. Other questions?
Yeah, so the lines in the while loop, check if n is even,
Mm-hmm.
just to be sure it's going to be like n modulus.
Exactly, yep. The same way. Only thing that's changing, so this is like standard stuff that you probably gonna have to always do when reading from a file, like for your homework. This is gonna be like the template you're gonna wanna like really understand. It's only gonna tweak based on what your data looks like. If your data says read entire lines, then you would just change this piece to use getLine instead. But everything prior would pretty much be exactly the same. And then what you wanna do with it on each line is gonna come inside the while loop. So let's say my data was some names, right? Like 4 names. And let's say I wanna print the first letter of each name. I would use getLine because that name could be like first name space, last name space, suffix or something like that. Like it could be an entire line. So I'll use getLine. I would have a string variable to store it. And then down here, once I get into my while loop, I would print out that name at 0. The same way I would do it like in the normal program is the same way I'm gonna transfer that over to reading from files.
Okay, hypothetical right here.
Mm-hmm.
So after we check if the name can be divided by 2, and we want to continue, will we just use continue or will we just use break to like?
It's already gonna continue.
It's already gonna continue, so we don't have to program that.
Just like if it was a loop, right? This is just a loop, a normal loop. So if you had a for loop, and let's say you want to print out some even numbers, like you don't necessarily have to say continue or break, or like continue. You don't have to say that. Continue is going to actually just skip that iteration of the loop. So you just need your if statement and print the number. That's it. Any other questions on this slide? So some takeaways, and I kind of went through them already while we were like explaining that, but because these values were one value per line, technically it might have felt like we could use getLine or use our input operators. Because it's only one value per line, it probably would have given us the same thing. The difference is, since we want to check for even or odd, we needed that value to be an int. It couldn't have been a string. We can't check it for a string. String's value is even or odd, right? It needs to be an int. Therefore, I had to use my input operator instead of getLine. So the same principles, like I say, apply to reading from files. And then lastly, I have to close that file. So I didn't forget, even though I know it's going to do it for me, my last slide, or my last step in the blue is for me to close that file. So now we're going to do another example. I'll give y'all a second to read over it. Yeah, each line isn't a character. Each line is a string. All right, let's see. Any ideas? Any ideas? What's up?
This is only looking at
So we
the first
start
letter,
with
let's see if there's any-
if string file, quotation marks, work, intended
Yeah.
This is
txt.
string because
After that, we check if it's open. So
Mhm.
if file dot is underscore open. Then
So what technique will we use to, and let me show the data, because the data ultimately like kind of determines what technique we have to use to read it, right? So let's say this is my data, and we're gonna do that one on the scratch pad to show that all this even works. So this is my data, right? So what technique do we think we could use to read in this data? And remember, it's one name per line.
so I'm thinking you could be like if the name dot substring and like the first three,
yeah.
0 to like 2
Mhm.
equals dr
Right.
dot, then see what was the
Yeah.
rest of the task?
So yeah, print out the names that start with doctor, basically.
Yeah, then like see out.
That name.
Yeah, see out.
All right, I like that. Let's see what we got. So I'm about to open up the scratch pad and give it a try. Let's see what we got. So I need something up here.
Oh yeah, the F string. Include F.
Bet. F string. So I could delete this, I guess. Yeah, so like we were saying with input and output, we got IO stream, then here we got F stream. I assume it's a lot more. I don't know, I be kind of learning this stuff day by day a little bit. I don't know. All right, so what's the next thing we need? This says your code goes here, so that's where I'm gonna try to start at.
If string file.
If stream file, like that.
Yeah, then the parentheses.
Mhm.
Inside the parentheses, you get the quotation, and the name of the file.
I think it's attendees.txt, right?
Yeah.
So where is that file at? I don't think I don't have that up here. So is this gonna work? Let's say I try to open this file. Is it gonna work?
We could probably make that.
We can make it. Exactly. So what I'm gonna do is just copy this. And this is what you wanna do before you just try to open a file that doesn't exist. In your homework, you don't need to create any files though. But for the purpose of this, I'm showing you that if I tried to run this or like check if it's open, it's not gonna be open because it doesn't exist. But for your homework, I already created those files for you. So I'm gonna do a new file. I'm gonna call it attendees.txt, and I'm gonna just paste those names in there. So that way, when I try to open it, it knows what I'm talking about.
Wait, can I see the names real quick?
Oh, my bad. I forgot y'all don't have that. That slides. Yeah. I'll put this back. Oh, snap. Are we good to continue? Almost. Oh yeah, my bad. I didn't realize y'all would need the names too. My bad. Should I just add the file as a to the? Are you good? Y'all. We got it. All right. So I created that file attendees.txt. So when I go to create that object, it looks like it's trying to open that file. I think now that should work. So what comes next? Remember, trying to read these names in line by line and print out the ones that start with DR period.
Yeah, well, first you check if it's open.
If, how do I do that?
File dot
Is open. See how I highlighted? It already gave me the whoops. It said I already know exactly what you're trying to do. It's already showing me. So let's say I'ma just, if it's open, I'ma print out file is open just so I know for my own sanity that it opened up. All right, so I check if the file is open. If so, I print out file is open. That works so far, so I'll proceed. I wonder if I remove this, let's say I make this an invalid file name, do we think it should still open? I hope not. All right, boom, we didn't get any output. It couldn't successfully open that file because it doesn't exist. So I'm gonna replace it back. And then instead of this cout statement, we actually want what? Remember, we read in values from this file line by line. So each of these values should independently be a what? A string. A string. So I'm gonna create that string right here. And what should I call this string? Okay. I'm gonna do attendee. Like that. I was just gonna say name, but I like attendee. That's more descriptive. So then what comes next after I create that variable?
If attendee dot substring.
So we got one step before that. Because right now we didn't start reading from the file yet. The while loop. So we need the while loop, right? We're gonna say while, and what's our condition for the while loop?
If it don't equal, the first 3 letters of the substring don't equal DR.
Close. That's gonna be the if statement in here. But we need a while loop. The while loop, remember, so far this if statement and this while loop are gonna be consistent pretty much for every program. When you're reading from a file, you need the if statement to check if it's open. The while loop is to tell the program when to start reading from the file.
File, you do get line attendee?
Get line. Exactly, because we're trying to start reading, right? We're ready to start reading from the file. So I'm gonna do attendee, and what goes on the left side? What's file? Yep. While we're able to read a line from the file into our variable attendee, let's proceed.
Can you add more than one file?
Like right here? No. So if I wanted to create an object for another file, I would just do this and then put whatever that file name is, and then I have to make this like file 2. So if I'm reading through multiple files at one time, I would need an object for each one. And I probably need to say something like if the first file is open and the second file is open to verify all of them were open successfully. So everything you do for one, you pretty much got to do for all of them. So while we're able to get a new line from the file and store it into attendee, we want to do what? Now we can start thinking about our if statement. What's our if statement? Remember it says take each string and only print it out if it starts with DR period.
Attendee dot substring 0, 3.
substring 0, 3
Equals quotations DR.
this. Okay. If attendee dot substring 03 equals dr period, do what?
C out attendee.
See out attendee. How we feel about this? Thumbs up. We think it's gonna work. Anybody feel otherwise? Think.
Wait, where's the close file?
Wait a minute.
Oh yeah, you forgot to say
All right. And so where would I close the file at?
after the while.
After the while loop. So file dot close.
No, it shouldn't be like.
Nah, he's right.
Nah,
He right. He right. So because we're only gonna get outside of the while loop once the file has no more contents. That's when we want to manually close it. So I'm gonna put end of while loop, and this is end of if statement. We think this should work. Hopefully.
That's what I put down.
Look like we did it to me.
Type shit.
Hell yeah.
Look like we did it to me. Anybody confused on why it works? Questions about why it works?
Oh yeah.
Why we do it this way?
Oh yeah.
The code.
Oh yeah. Hey gang, the whoops bro.
Yours?
No, swear. Bro.
Yeah.
The what, bro?
No swear.
It's so bro.
What's broke about it?
Like I code.
Stop.
When I did it, it did. I tried again though.
Either else and I code.
This nigga here, bro. You always gotta like.
Yeah, I'm like recording, so I'm trying to just like leave them alone. But so we understand why it worked.
What is get line file attendee?
You said what is it?
What you mean about that, my boy?
So, get line file attendee is saying, while we're able to get a new line and put that line from the file into attendee, then we should do all of this stuff in here. So remember, our file looks like this. Our file looks like this on the inside.
And so why did you choose 0 and 3 for that?
So why did you choose 0 and 3, Alex?
Because it starts at 0 and it is going 3 characters.
Right. 0, 1, 2. Those are 3 characters. Because we're checking for who's a doctor that RSVP for this conference. So if the name didn't start with DR dot, then we don't want to print it out. We only want the ones that start with DR, period. Did I answer your question, or you want me to explain it again? So I can try. I think the slides might have touched on it a little more than how I explained it. Let's see. So, all right, this might answer that. So this first row right here, right, is using get line. Get line means I want to read an entire line from this file. The reason I use that for the names is because a name is like first name, last name, and in that case, it had a prefix, doctor. They could also have a suffix. Let's say they're the third or a junior. So a name could be two. It could be 2 values, just a first and last name. It could be 3 values, the prefix, first and last name, or first name, last name, suffix. Like there's too many variants, so I'm gonna just read the whole line. I know my data is separating these names by line, so I'm gonna read in the whole line. And I think with get line before, we've only had CN right here. This means ask the user for the value. We're not asking the user for a value, we're getting it from a file. So I'm gonna put the file right there. I put the file in there and I'm saying take whatever you just read in from the file and store it in that variable. So these are all the pieces I need to like successfully read a value from the file by line and store it in a variable.
So would you say input operators are more like intricate, you know?
Yeah, they're more fine grained, like you want every single
Yeah.
value one by one. Yep. Any other questions on the solution about the operators, about anything? At this point, it's your classwork, so y'all sure there's no more questions? We get everything?
Mm-hmm.
When are you posting this one?
Which one? Oh, you said did I post them? I can post them now. If y'all don't have any more questions, I can get them up. Actually, I got a question real quick. So, for y'all homework, it's a lot dealing with output files. I was gonna say that for like tomorrow or Thursday, but if y'all, do y'all want it now? Like, should I? It's actually probably like 10 minutes. If y'all get that, you're gonna get output file. Or do y'all want to just start on the classwork stuff? Classwork.
Wait, hold on, what's the question?
For your homework, the harder stuff is dealing with output files. So you're reading something from an input file, doing something with it, you writing that data to an output file. I didn't teach the second half of that yet, because it's for like tomorrow or Thursday. But it's in these slides, so I can teach it real quick if you want. Like if you want to learn that to do your homework.
Let's do it.
Everybody cool with that? And I can always go back over it tomorrow or and Thursday, but just so I give it to you so you can do the work, I'll go through it. So I could try to finish in like 10 minutes. So remember, dealing with input files, you have IF string, the name of your variable, and then the file that you're trying to open as an input file. You're going to have the same syntax for an output file, except this IF string becomes OF string, which means output file. You're going to still create an object for it. The same way you did with the input file, you create an object for your output file. You're going to name it. I think I meant to put like output right here. And then boom. So you name it. I would name it output file or just output. And then you have to pass in the value of a file that you want to write all this data to. I would try to play around with this piece. I don't think this file has to already be created. I think if it's not created, it'll create it for you. But try it out. Try it out and see. So when we see this operator, what does this normally mean? Output. What goes on the left? What you mean the output?
Variable.
The left side?
Wait, oh no, that's
That's out.
Yeah.
So normally we have cout, our output operator, and then the value. So this could be a variable, this could be a raw value, could be inline. It doesn't matter. We have our output operator in the middle. And this just tells C++ send whatever this is to the console, or like the terminal window, which is what you normally see when you run it in AirStem. Output gets printed out right there. Output doesn't always have to mean print out this value or print out these values in the console though. It can also mean send this data to a file. So just like we have cout, this sends it to a terminal window. We can literally just replace cout with the output file object. Replace cout with the output file object. This sends that data to the output file instead. Let's say I wanted to print out the data and send it to the output file. I can have one statement that prints it using cout, and then the subsequent one that sends it to the output file. And then there was like another challenge, but with that, I think y'all should be able to like do the homework. And then Wednesday and Thursday we'll like actually go deeper into it, but that's like mainly what you need. Question?
Okay, so question is a little bit unrelated, but you said COut doesn't necessarily mean print out, right?
Well, cout means print out, but I'm saying when we use the less than, we don't always have to have cout on the left side.
Yeah, output doesn't necessarily mean.
Right,
print out.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so would you return an output, like return, like when you create a function, you say return, would you turn an output and you send it?
No. Not normally we don't. In CS normally we don't say return is output. We just call it like return file. Just to avoid the confusion. So, what is it? I can look at it deeper. I think you got this. I think it's telling you to do something specific and you missing what it's telling you. 3:30 to 5. Do I need to go back through output file or we get it? Was it pretty simple? Got it. And I think you did the same thing that he did, and which is not right. Yeah, I'll look at it in a second. No more questions? Y'all want to just work on the classwork?
I guess we all do.
All right, bet.
Well, y'all want to. No, that's exactly.